Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are, and wherever you may be. Thank you very much for making us a part of your day. I am Brad Franklin, creative content writer here in Chesterfield, and I'm very glad to tell you that Chesterfield Behind the Mic is on the air once again. We've got an interesting show for you today, a little bit of a different topic, something that we haven't talked a lot about, but something that is obviously on the minds of a lot of folks, especially after the recent Ettrick Landing announcement and sort of the idea of community enhancement, of revitalization of affordable housing and things like that come to the community. I want to welcome our guest today, who is Dan Cohen, who is our Director of Community Enhancement. Dan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great.
I appreciate your time. Obviously, this is something that for a lot of communities, I think around not just Virginia, but throughout, folks are finding out that this is it's a topic that has the potential to make a real difference, not just for the community at large, but especially for a lot of different people. Before we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of that conversation, Dan, I want to kind of talk about a little bit about your background. I always like to give guests a chance to sort of talk through sort of their how they came to be sitting in the chair across from me, right? So how is it that you came to be the Director of Community Enhancement? Tell me a little bit about sort of your background and how it is that what your experiences are that brought you here.
Sure. Thank you so much. I grew up in New York City. That's where I spent my formative years. I've lived in San Antonio, Texas,
okay.
Los Angeles, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Richmond, Norfolk. So, I've been a few places, right, to say the least.
Right.
I've been with the county not quite 5 years.
Okay.
The Community Enhancement Department was formed several years before I got here, as a matter of fact. And one of the reasons why the job is so interesting to me is it really allows me to play to a lot of the strengths that I think that I have. I mean, the
right.
department is an amalgamation of many things:
mm-hmm.
code enforcement, license inspection, community revitalization, housing,
mm-hmm.
lighting, and then we have this little group called Keep Chesterfield Beautiful, which kind
mm-hmm.
of acts as our public works department.
Right.
So maybe at first all those things don't seem integrated, but at the end of the day, it really is about enhancing the values in the neighborhoods that exist in the county.
Right. And then in terms of, I can imagine for a lot of people who get into the kind of work you do, I would imagine at some point there was some sort of nexus, right? Some sort of connection for you that connected sort of your own internal thoughts about the world or whatever that also connected with the work that you do. Was there, for you, what brought you to this line of work? What was it about this that really spoke to you?
Sure. So I grew up in an apartment,
mm-hmm.
In New York City. My father was a postal worker at the time,
okay.
and my mother was a stay-at-home mom until we actually got a chance to move to the suburbs, which mm-hmm. I'll get to in a moment. And even for a while, I lived in what was called public housing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to the suburbs when I was high school age, really because my mother's father passed away,
okay.
and left my mother enough money for a down payment, which actually got us to the suburbs. And at one point in time, that was sort of how the American dream was
right.
came to be. You
right.
lived in an apartment, you saved up enough money, perhaps you got a little inheritance, or you saved up enough
right.
money to have that down payment, and you made it to the suburbs and you made it to home ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really affected the choices that I've made. Even in terms of my educational background, going to planning and architecture school,
right.
and getting involved in the nonprofit housing world,
mm-hmm.
and as a housing director at one point in time when I still lived in California, and coming to Chesterfield was an opportunity actually to put into practice many of the things that I've learned over the years.
Right. Now, this is going to be a funny question to somebody who works in community enhancement, who is the director of a department of community enhancement. But I'm curious, what is community enhancement? Like, how would you describe that to folks who may be listening who don't have kind of a good frame of reference for what it is? How would you describe what community enhancement is?
How do we make living and working in the county a better environment for all of you? We have an opportunity. We work with neighborhoods, for example.
Mm-hmm.
We engage with community residents and do community cleanups, where we provide dumpsters for folks, as a matter of fact, and work with volunteers,
mm-hmm.
A different neighborhood, different periods of time during the year to basically, clean up the neighborhoods for folks to get rid of those kinds of things.
Right.
It's also an opportunity, and something that I wanted to do for a long time, is to be able to use code enforcement in a way to actually bring about, some changes. Mm-hmm. In many other places that I've worked, or in other places in the United States, It's not often that actually that code enforcement can be used to actually get to a better outcome, as opposed to just looking at enforcement as I issue a fine or a citation or something like that, and you pay the fine or fix it. There's actually something good that can come out of that. And I know you and I will be talking about a couple of those things a little bit later in the podcast.
Yeah. And in terms of, you mentioned this, you sort of alluded to this earlier, right? The idea that there are so many different parts of sort of the puzzle that is community enhancement, right? And they're all, like I mentioned, sort of a nexus between sort of your interest and your opportunity, right? In terms of what community enhancement does, you mentioned that there were lots of different parts of that puzzle and the way that everything sort of fits together. And I'm just curious, as you've kind of gotten settled in here in Chesterfield, which, by the way, how long have you been with Chesterfield County?
About 4.5 years.
Okay. So for the last 4.5 years, as you've seen sort of things starting to progress, how would you say that your department and the impact that you're able to have on the community, how would you say that has sort of come together in the way that all of the different, tools in your tool bag, so to speak, are at your disposal? Like how has that gone for the department, and how has all of the different things you guys do, how has some of that changed? How is it different now maybe versus when you first started?
Well, first of all, I do have to say that I really do have a wonderful staff of people. I mean, they're probably the best people that I've ever worked with. And that makes working joyful and easier, as a matter of fact. And we really do get along, and they're very dedicated. But I think it really starts with having, a vision and then a strategy as well. And then we also, and thanks to the assistant director, Rich Billingsley, we keep tabs on what we do. We have metrics for everything that we do, and we use that to guide us and look at the successes and sometimes the failures, as a matter of fact, and make some changes. And I also have to say that I'm very fortunate to work in a county where you're allowed to take some risks sometimes, because government as an entity tends to be a little bit risk adverse, but folks around here recognize. And I don't mean just the administration. This was even the board members that I walked into when I came here. I'll never forget, one of the board members, who's no longer on the board, said, if you try something and it doesn't work, don't be afraid to change it. And that's really refreshing, and that really defines kind of how we work. And I had the opportunity when I came here to create something, to be honest with you, because I think that wasn't necessarily the case, beforehand. And I was given, and I still am given a lot of latitude to make those calls and those adjustments. It's like being an adult, which is really who I am at this point in my life.
Yeah. Now, in terms of the things that you guys are able to do, and certainly some of the impacts that have been felt in the community, one of the things I really want to talk to you about is the Ettrick Landing project. Obviously, affordable housing is, for a lot of people, it's the difference between happiness and not, right? For a lot of folks out there, especially in these times, finding housing that is affordable is an incredibly difficult process. I also understand that for a lot of people who hear the term affordable housing, they think it means something that it doesn't necessarily mean. So I'm curious to get first, how would you sort of describe what affordable housing is? And talk to me a little bit about sort of the Ettrick Landing project and why that is such a big deal for Chesterfield County.
Sure. There are many definitions for what affordable housing is. There's a standard definition in the literature that a person shouldn't pay, or a household shouldn't pay, more than 30% of their income towards their rent or their mortgage. What's happened, over the last decades, quite frankly, is we're way past the 30% mark. In fact, folks, not just in Chesterfield, but many places in the United States, are paying 50% of their income towards their house payments and things like that. And that stretches you, to say the least. I mean, shelter is one of the most important things that you could have.
For sure.
Next to food and water and clothing. And so, as things have gotten more expensive, it's gotten much more difficult for a lot of folks, especially for folks, quite frankly, who make a whole lot less income. And sometimes I don't think we think about the folks, we don't think about the people behind the income. So we're talking about folks who are public servants. We're talking about folks in the medical industry. We're talking about the folks who serve you food. We're talking about folks who work in a lot of retail places and things like that. Those are real people. Those are people who live here. A lot of people have grown up here. So in a certain sense, they're our own, And in a lot of cases, and mine in particular too, by the way, there are children.
Right.
I mean, I do have a child who's 27 years old who lives at home because, quite frankly, $30,000 doesn't cut an apartment anymore. And so that's sort of what an affordability could mean.
Right.
I think the issue sometimes is that there's a stigma attached to this word affordable housing as opposed to housing that is affordable, which is really how I would rather define it.
Right.
And there's a lot of folks who have gotten older and grown up in a different generation when affordable housing meant public housing.
Right.
Well, public housing hasn't been constructed in 60 years.
Right.
Okay, so the kind of housing that is affordable is actually not built or constructed anymore by public housing entities. They're actually constructed by private developers, whether or not they're for-profit or non-profit, with tremendous layers of subsidies, and they're owned and managed by private entities with private property management companies, as a matter of fact. So the whole industry has changed, as a matter of fact, to a large degree. To get to your point about Ettrick Landing as an example, so one of the things that the county did that I really thought was quite brilliant, and again, there was some latitude that I was given here, is the county created a land bank, and it's the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, who actually is the owner of the property that you called Ettrick Landing.
Right.
And what a land bank is, it's an organization that actually holds on to the land in perpetuity. And when you build a project like Ettrick Landing, which is 10 units, it is one of the first, to my knowledge, the first subdivision done by a land bank entity in the United States.
Oh, wow. What
makes it affordable is that the person who buys the house gets a mortgage. If property is usually about 1/3 of the cost of a payment, for example, and you remove the cost of the land, then the unit that you live in is that much cheaper, making it more affordable. As I said, it is a home ownership opportunity, which appeals to a lot of people. It gives you an opportunity to build a little equity. As a matter of fact, it could appeal to a younger person who's first starting out. And by the way, Maggie Walker Community Land Trust will work with individuals who live there on how to save money, how to be an appropriate homeowner. Because if you grew up like me in an apartment, you don't know how to fix anything.
Right.
So these people actually learn how to take care of their houses and how to manage their money.
Right.
It also could work for seniors who are on fixed incomes who want to downsize, as a matter of fact. And that is one of the larger issues that we have in Chesterfield County, is the graying of the population, and the fact that there is so little affordable housing for our seniors, the folks who actually currently live here.
Right. And then, and to your point about it, that it's affordable housing. The correct term really is housing that is affordable. It's good for not just the people who live in those houses, but for the community at large, because to your point, it's not just this specific group that can access it. It's a wide range of folks. And certainly in terms of the grain of the population, and we know that we have a significant boomer population that is going to at some point, want to step down, right, from maybe the larger houses that maybe some folks in that generation have had, and finding places that fit where they want to be. Certainly there are a lot of folks in Chesterfield who have been here a long time, who have a lot of, they put a lot of time and effort and sweat, tears into this community. Being able to find places to stay here and to do that here is certainly something that's a big focus. One of the things you and I talked about before we recorded was this idea of economic development and the role that affordable housing, or that revitalization and community enhancement can play in that. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts on that, because it's a really interesting way to look at. We are so very focused on services and tax rates and things, which we makes total sense. But one of the pieces of the puzzle that I don't think gets enough attention is the idea of housing and of revitalization, and using something that was there to put something new there, as opposed to just flat cutting down a bunch of trees and putting up something, quote unquote brand new. And I'm just curious to get your point of view on how community enhancement plays a role in the larger sort of economic development portion of the plan of the county.
So let me get to that in 1 second, because I want to hit the point that you made about the seniors who live here. in a certain sense, we are living a lot longer, and we're staying in our houses a whole lot longer.
For sure.
So in some respects, and if you talk to organizations like the Richmond Association of Realtors, they'll say that the natural evolution of our housing stock has stalled a little bit, where seniors actually do downsize, move someplace else, and things like that, and their housing becomes available for other folks.
Right.
Well, we're living longer. There aren't places that are affordable to a lot of folks, especially if you're a senior on a fixed income.
Right.
And the house prices have gone up so much in the last 5 or 6 years. I think it's about 37%.
Wow.
So we're talking about house prices that are $375,000 a year, that it's even hard for the next generation of people to actually afford to buy that house.
Right.
So we're sort of stalled in that market space, as a matter of fact, which doesn't help the situation, at all. To your other point about housing kind of as an economic development tool, I think we also see housing as an individual choice.
Right.
You get your own mortgage, you pay your own rent.
Right.
Well, housing needs to be seen as a social good, as a matter of fact. And if housing isn't affordable, it's very hard sometimes. It'll get to a point, perhaps, in some places already witnessed this, where a worker has to live miles and miles and counties away from the place that they're employed because they can't afford the house, or the apartment in the location where they happen to live. Right. And so that's something that certainly occurs in a lot of places. And so I think building housing for all types of people stabilizes your neighborhood, provides a wide range of income and a diversity of population that I think is very healthy, for a community. I mean, you don't want a community of just one type. Any person. So I think it's one of the reasons why, for example, mixed use development is so popular, because there's several different places where you can make money. That if one of those places isn't doing well, let's say retail, I can make up for it and still make a profit because I'm doing well on the rental side or something like that, right? And so you really want a mix of income groups and a mix of individuals, to make sense of that.
For sure.
I also don't think we see necessarily as housing as if I'm housing people of all types and they're living here, they're also spending their disposable income here, as a matter of fact. Yeah. And we're taking some of our empty spaces and turning them into productive assets. You're increasing the tax base, as well, which I think is a really key economic indicator that sometimes gets overlooked. Yeah.
And what's interesting too, because we talk a lot about sports tourism and the idea of bringing people in and having them sort of spend their money here. And then necessarily those folks then leave, and there's the benefit of not having to sort of afford those folks the same services that you might a resident, right? You don't have to, people who visit for hockey tournaments, you don't have to worry about if their house burns down. You don't have to worry about if they need police, they need to have their kids in schools, right? But at the same token, the folks who are here to make the opportunities, to make their lives, to make the services they receive, all of it, it makes a lot of sense to me, this idea of the social benefit versus the individual. And I also think in terms of the role that your department plays in the bigger picture, I'm just curious to get your thoughts. And obviously Ettrick Landing is a huge deal. I'm just curious, what's the way that thing, once it's in the process, it's coming online, when you start to see the impact of that, do you see that impact because you see more projects like that, or is it through just sort of the natural way of making things like that possible for people?
Well, let me say that the way Ettrick Landing came about is because it was an annex site of an old school, as a matter of fact, and it was declared surplus property. And the Board of Supervisors was kind enough, actually, to donate that property to the Maggie Walker Land Bank. Right. We also took some of the federal funds that we have that actually are managed by the Community Enhancement Department and put it towards that particular project. So when you say, what does the department do, we provide one of the layers of financing for different projects. So there's an additional project going on, actually two of them. One of them is called Bermuda Estates, which is a manufactured housing community on Route 1. And that actually for me was one of the most important things that I've probably ever done, because it really did marry code enforcement with anti-displacement, keeping the folks who were there to stay in those places, as a matter of fact. Right. And even and over time, all those units are going to get replaced. The folks who live there are going to get brand new manufactured housing units. So it stabilized an area, as a matter of fact, and provided additional housing.
Right.
And there's an additional project a little bit further down the road, also on Route 1. There's an historic African-American hotel called the Colebrook. It actually was in the Green Book. It's where African-Americans stayed during segregation, as a matter of fact. And unfortunately, the motel, fell apart. It was owned by a family who wasn't interested in keeping it up. And it attracted vagrants of all kind, of humankind and four-legged kind, as a matter of fact. And it really became a health and safety issue, as a matter of fact. And by using code enforcement and our tools under violations, and working with a wonderful county attorney, by the way, also, we were able to actually convince the owner of the property to sell the property. And I was able to convince, a nonprofit housing corporation to actually purchase the property and help arrange that transaction, as a department to sort of broker the deal. And then we added some federal dollars to the project. And hopefully that will come out of the ground sometime in calendar year 2023. So I think I look at things like Ettrick Landing and Colebrook and Bermuda States as opportunities. Okay, I mean that's really what they are, in taking advantage of the situation that presented itself, and also I think having really good examples of what we mean when we're talking about housing that is affordable for folks.
Right.
Putting examples on the ground, I think, is really critical, because it helps change the frames of reference for folks who think that affordable housing is only of a certain type,
right?
Especially the type, quite frankly, that has really not aged well over the course of 60 years,
right?
To be honest with you, and so that's in part what as I see the goal on the housing side. We're hoping for some other opportunities where there might be some other properties that the county already owns, schools, or actually other perhaps industrial land that might not accommodate the kinds of businesses that we're looking to attract as a sweetener to try and help some of these deals to take place.
All right, last one for you, Dan, and I'm going to give you a prompt here, and I'm going to let you sort of run with it. But I'm just curious, because hearing you talk about sort of some of the issues in your line of work, it kind of feels like you're a solutions person, where you take a situation and you use whatever tools that are at your disposal to sort of not just find a solution for that person, but for that neighborhood and that community and that county. And I'm just curious to get you to react to that, and what you think of when you think of sort of your role, your department's role in, like I said, the greater picture for all of Chesterfield. Because it feels like to me what you guys do is you go in where a problem might exist, and you figure out a way to not just make it right for the county or for the neighborhood, but also for the person, the entity, whoever that owns that piece of property. How would you sort of describe it? Does that sort of jive in your head with the way that you live it on a daily basis?
No, that's a very kind thing that you said. I think that we see ourselves as problem solvers, and quite frankly, I'm opportunistic. Where we could take advantage of a situation for the public good is where I think we all like to play, and it's really not just me. It really is the ethos that is in our department, whether or not it's license inspection or code enforcement or keep Chesterfield beautiful. Where can we fix the situation to make it better for the businesses and the citizens who are part of Chesterfield County?
Good deal. Well, Dan, thank you very much for joining the podcast. I really appreciate it. Something tells me you're going to be back, but I appreciate you coming on.
This is a great time. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right. Now, make sure you check us out on social media. On Twitter, it's at Chesterfield VA, and on Instagram, it's Chesterfield Virginia, all one word. And on Facebook, check out our podcast page. Just search Chesterfield Behind the Mic. Make sure to like that page so you can keep up as we go forward. Now, let me tell you about all the ways you can check us out. You can watch us on our YouTube channel as well as on our website at Chesterfield.gov/podcast. An audio-only version of the show is available there, as well as on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, and a whole host of other services. You can also watch the show on WCCT Thursday through Sunday at 7, on the weekends at noon. That's Comcast Channel 98 and Verizon Channel 28. And lastly, you can check out Chesterfield.gov/connect with us for more ways for you to get in touch with us and for us to get in touch with you. My thanks to my director, Martin Stith, our executive producer, Teresa, Bonifas, and all the crew here in Communications Media for making this possible. Thank you very much for all that you do. And from all of us here in Chesterfield, thank you very much for making this part of your day. We'll see you again real soon. Take good care.